The plan in this video is to build 2 cedar strip kayaks in around 2 weeks. The design is the petrol play from Guillemot Kayaks. It's a stunning looking vessel and it's going to be a challenge to build them in such a short time. The first thing to do is cut all the strips from these Australian red cedar boards, and red cedar timber is no longer produced and difficult to find. I found these old boards from Mooloo Timbers and Darcy was super helpful finding exactly what I needed, and we were very lucky that all the boards are full length. There's over 2,000 feet of strips to prepare, so I got some help off Bradley. I won't be building the kayaks on my own, and some of you may remember Corin from the kumiko gates we built last year. He'll be arriving soon and we're making a kayak each. I'm trying to get the strips prepared so we can get straight onto building when he gets here. Now that the strips are cut, I need to route a cove down one edge and a bead down the other. This joint will allow the strips to conform to the shape of the kayak and make the build a little easier. I'm running a bead on one edge first, and then I'm flipping the strips 180 degrees and then cutting the coves, and in the process I'm mixing up the strips to make them random and switching some of them end for end. That was a fair amount of work, but they're all done and it was a big saving to mill them myself. For 2 kayaks it would have cost over 3,000 Australian dollars for pre-prepared strips, and these boards cost under 700. We bought the full-size plans to work off and Corin has arrived too, so we'll start making the forms. We'll stick the templates onto 1/2-inch plywood and cut them out with a jigsaw and bandsaw. My hope with this video is to inspire anyone who fancies tackling this project to give it a go. I'm trying to be fairly thorough, but there's far too much information to fit into one video. So if you do want more info, then check out Nick's videos. He has a 23-part series of this kayak, and it's what we used alongside his books for this build. I'm staying slightly away from the line, and then we'll sand up to that and refine them. They need a rectangle removing out of the centre so the forms can be mounted onto a strongback, which in our case will be a piece of aluminium box section. I'll cut them roughly with a jigsaw, then clean them up with a template and a pattern following bit on the router table. They need to be a little oversized to allow for adjustment, so they don't need to be super precise. The plans allow to build 1 kayak from a set of plans, but Nick from Guillemot Kayaks kindly gave us the go-ahead to make 2. Off camera we knocked together these simple sawhorses which we'll modify as we go. The end forms at the bow and the stern slide onto the box section, then a piece of wood either side keeps them centred. We made these spaces off camera to keep the forms the correct distance apart, with the centre one being a little different. This one is in 2 pieces, which is driven apart with wedges and locking all the forms and spaces together. Bit more. And again, that was almost... Next we made adjustments and aligned them all using the sight lines on each form. It was a little trial and error, but not too difficult. It's probably not necessary, but a bit of hot glue can't hurt and keep them in the right position. That's the forms and the strongback done, so next we can make the first part of the actual kayak, and that's the inner stems. These will be taped to the end forms, and when we start fitting the strips to the forms, the strips will get glued directly to these inner stems. As they're positioned at the pointy ends of the kayak, they need a bevel planing onto them. While I'm making mine, Corin is making his, and he's decided to do those on the belt grinder. Next, I'll continue the bevel onto the end forms. Now they're done, we can start installing the strips, but first we'll put some packing tape onto the forms so the strips don't stick to them. I'm set up in the wood workshop and Corin is set up in the other side in the metal workshop. We'll work together to begin with to find our feet, and then we'll start working on our own kayaks. The first strips have to be bent into shape at the bow and the stern, and to help with the bend we're planing a taper about 4 feet onto each end, and I'm planing 4 strips together to make it easier, and that's 2 strips for each kayak. The first strip goes along the shear line where the deck meets the hull, and we've got it upside down and we're starting on the hull. We're hot gluing the strips to the forms. On anywhere the hot glue struggles a little, we've decided to brad nail those. We're nailing through a thin strip which can be easily removed, leaving the head of the nail exposed, making that easy to remove too. And as I mentioned earlier, the strip gets glued with regular wood glue to the inner stem. The next strip gets glued to the shear line strip, but only in the middle. It's then allowed to wrap around the forms where it wants to sit comfortably without being manipulated. The space left gets filled out with cheetah strips. A taper needs planing on one end of the strips, and I'll mark that in place. Once the taper has been established and I've done a test fit, it then needs a bead planing onto the taper, and that's to fit into the cove of the shear line strip. It takes a couple of times to get it right, but it's actually a pretty easy process and doesn't take too long at all. The first one does take the longest, then each taper gets shorter and it gets quicker. I'm filming my progress as I go, but Corin is making great progress too on his in the next room, and because he isn't filming, he's getting ahead and he's going great. I've completed all the cheetahs, so I can start adding some full length strips up the sides. I'm installing a strip on one side, and then while the glue is setting, I'll fit one to the other, and then I can go back to the previous one and remove the tape and continue on as so. An easier way to strip a kayak is to staple the strips, but then you have to live with the holes. I'm trying to avoid that, but if the strip does need some manipulation to conform to the forms, mainly at the bow and the stern, then I'm happy to use the odd brad nail. Now the sides are done and the next strip won't go around the chines with a cove and bead. It's asking too much of the joint, so instead the next strip needs fitting to the last one, and I'll start by cutting the last side strip down with a pole saw. To help mark a line on the outside of the hull, I need to transfer this line on the forms over to the outside, and I can easily do that with this simple jig. I'm cutting slightly away from the line, and I'll plane down to it with a cool new tool that I've just bought, which is a side rabbit plane. As well as planing down to the line, it also needs a bevel to join the next strip, and the angle of the bevel is marked on each form and changes from form to form, making a rolling bevel. It sounds difficult, but it really isn't. With an adjustment here and there, it's done in no time. Now I can fit the next strip, and off camera I cut the bead off on the table saw, and using a block plane I can match the bevel from the previous strip. It's probably time to check in with Corin and see his progress. He's not a woodworker, but he's going great and he's enjoying it. And we thought we'd take a moment for him to tell you a little bit more about himself.
My name's Corin. I am a maker from Sydney. I make all sorts of things, and one of the things that I'm most known for is barrel knives. Barrel knives are not a common type of knife. Well, these examples on the left are all over 100 years old. They work by depressing a clip on the back of the knife here. The inner slides out, we open it up, and it goes back together again, like so. And of course the knife can't close on your hand or on your fingers, and they were very popular, and also known as immigrants' knives or click knives, and all over 100 years old typically. These ones here are ones that I've made, so they have all Damascus fittings, sterling silver ferrules, and a nice click, which is most satisfying. And another one here. And that's what I do.
If anyone has any interest or questions about the barrel knives, then be sure to get in touch with him. He would be very happy to hear from you. I'll put his Instagram on the screen and links in the description. Anyway, back to the kayaks, and Corin has just about closed the hull in. Not bad for someone who felt out of his depth as a woodworker. We'll leave Corin to get on with his kayak and continue with mine, and next I'll add 2 keel strips right along the centre. They need a matching bevel planed on one of the edges, and in the middle of the strips the bevel is next to nothing, but at the bow and the stern it really gets into a fair angle. I'm holding the strip at the approximate angle it needs to be, and with the plane upright I can fairly accurately plane to the correct bevel. Once those fit together I need to taper the ends to fit the last strip. That looks pretty good, so next I'll do the other end. I'll glue the strips together, and I should mention they both have a cove facing outwards. Then I'll hot glue one side down to the forms for now and then tape them together. The next strips are like the cheetah strips that I fitted to the sides of the hull earlier, but these ones have a taper on each end, and that makes it a bit trickier as the strip has to be the perfect length, but with careful adjustment and dry fitting it isn't too difficult. I'm alternating each strip. I fit one along the centre line and then the next one towards the side of the hull, and that way the tapers become stepped, leaving an interesting pattern. The bottom can be stripped in many different ways, and Corin did his differently. He ran them all against the sides and then jointed the tapers along the centre line. I haven't shown it, but the second last strip, which is already installed, has had the cove planed off. That allows me to slot the last piece down into the recess once I've shaped it to fit. That's fitting well, and here's the last piece of the hull going in. I'm really happy with how that's gone, so let's check in with Corin and see where he's up to. He's flipped it over and he's already started the deck, and also at this point we've had a change of plan for the whole build in the video. It's taken longer than we'd expected, and Corin can only be here for so long. We planned for 2 weeks or so, but we're not going to get them finished in that time, so we're going to put mine aside for now, and we'll both work on Corin's, and we'll set that up in the woodworking side of the workshop. The only thing Corin's done different so far is to cut some silky oak and some white mahogany strips to make the design of the deck. Also, I should mention that the first strip of the deck isn't glued to the shear line strip on the hull, as the deck and the hull need to be separated at that joint later on to remove the forms. Stripping the deck is pretty straightforward now that we've done the hull. It's just making tapers and fitting a strip at a time. That's the silky oak and the white mahogany strips done, so next we need to fill in the gaps, all with straight pieces working from the centre line. These ones are pretty easy as they only have a taper on the one end, and they can be left long the other end ready to be trimmed for where the cockpit will be. I reckon the deck looks fantastic and Corin's design really worked out. That's the stripping done, and I really enjoyed that part of the project. Next we'll scrape the deck with card scrapers, taking off the corners and any high spots. The scraping gets it so far, but next we'll sand it, and Klingspor has provided us with a heap of discs to try out on this project, so a big thanks to them. I love the discs and they were awesome on my new sander that I just treated myself to. That's the deck done, next we'll scrape and sand the hull. We're making good progress now working together on the kayak. I just need to figure out how to make an interesting video of finishing my kayak. And by the way, I'm thinking of adding kumiko, but I haven't quite decided yet and still thinking about it. That looks pretty neat. Next we need to start the cockpit, and for that I need to cut some veneers from silky oak. I'll sand and glue them to a piece of plywood, and from that we can cut out the cockpit. We need 2 boards like this. I'm just showing the one here, but we are making a second one. I was hoping to fit it in my vacuum bag, but it was just too big, so weights will have to do. It's far too big to fit through the thicknesser, but those Klingspor mesh discs sanded it down in no time at all. Even though I haven't shown the second piece, that one fits around the outside of this piece with a puzzle joint to lock them together. Corin is refining them on the belt grinder, and here you can see that second piece. While we were working at fitting the cockpit pieces together, we had a visitor in the workshop. After a bit of tinkering, they're ready to fit and fix together, and we'll do that with spots of CA glue and sprayed with accelerator. We'll start by locking the joints together first, gluing them from the back, and then start fixing the pieces together around the edge. It was a bit of a wrestle, as I think the veneer was left a bit too thick. It was also very dry and it cracked in a few places, but nothing that we couldn't fix up with a bit of glue. Next, we're marking out a recess, and that's for the plywood cockpit to fit into. It's getting late in the day, and to get the kayak finished in our time frame, we need to get some fiberglassing started today. So we'll put the deck aside until the morning and start fiberglassing the hull. Neither of us have done any fiberglassing before, so this is going to be interesting, so fingers crossed it works out. I think that it's actually fairly straightforward. Just lay out the cloth carefully as it snags easily, and then wet it out evenly. We didn't have any disasters and we're fairly happy with it, but we also learned from it and reckon we didn't saturate the cloth quite as well as we should have. It's not too bad though. When it tacked off, we added a fill coat by spreading the resin with a spatula, and that's something else we realised we should have done differently, and we should have applied that with a brush. The hull will get another coat later on though. It was a long day and a late finish, and it wasn't the only one on this project. The next morning we removed it from the forms, we checked it out and it looked pretty good, and then after that we trimmed off all the excess glass. Next we put the hull back in the metal workshop and I started scraping it. While I was doing that, Corin started fitting the cockpit. We'll follow my progress for now, but we will get back to what Corin's doing later on. We could take the sanding further, but with our time constraints we need to draw the line somewhere, so that will have to do. Next we'll fiberglass the inside of the hull, but first the chines and the inner stems need reinforcing, and we'll do that with a fillet of epoxy mixed with sawdust. The fillet gets an extra strip of fiberglass, and then we'll roll out some cloth and fiberglass the inside of the hull. There's some bridging on the inside of the chines, but that's an easy enough fix by giving it a bit more cloth. Corin gave it a heavy fill coat off camera and we cleaned the edges up a bit, but they'll need more when we eventually fit the deck and the hull back together. Now we can get back to fitting the cockpit, and Corin is roughly fitting it into the recess. He's leaving a little room to fit a couple of accent strips. When they're fitted, we can then refine the outside of the cockpit to fit into the recess. Off camera we cut a thin strip of white mahogany and a thin strip of silky oak on the table saw, and Corin is gluing them in one at a time around the inside of the recess. This should be a nice detail and tie in with the rest of the design. Now we can refine the fit by taking off a little here and there where needed. We ended up a touch too short at the back, so we decided to fill that with a thin piece of white mahogany which we glued in off camera. The cockpit gets glued in using CA glue with accelerator for an instant bond, and this will hold it in place until the deck gets fiberglassed. The cockpit isn't perfect, but it's sanded up well and it looks great now the deck is starting to come together. Next we'll fiberglass the outside of the deck. The resin really brings out the grain and the design, and I reckon it's starting to look pretty awesome. Once the resin had tacked off, I brushed on a fill coat and it really started to look amazing. The cockpit isn't finished yet. We still need to add the coaming, which is a raised border that keeps out water. We'll clean up the inside edge, and that's to get it ready to glue short strips of red cedar to. The strips get glued together with regular glue using the coven bead and glued to the inside edge of the cockpit using hot glue. The hot glue is just to keep it in place until the coaming gets fiberglassed. After it's sanded smooth, we'll make a laminated rim which will form around the coaming. We'll need to remove it to clean it up, so we'll cover the coaming with packing tape first. The strips are made of black butt, which again I cut on the table saw off camera. The strips only go so far around for now, but we'll deal with the front section separately. We then added another strip of silky oak just to finish off the edge. Next, I cleaned up one of the faces with a block plane and then ran it through the table saw to clean up the opposite face and to keep a consistent thickness. My mini roundover plane that you may remember from a past video did a great job of putting a small radius around the edge. While I was doing that, Corin scraped the inside of the deck and then I helped to give it a quick sand. The rim is ready to position with the clamps, and then we'll glue it in place with CA glue, and we'll put a spot about every inch or so. After trimming off the ends, we'll make the front section from the same black butt strips. This time to glue the strips, we're using thin CA glue with accelerator, and the thin glue will run down between the strips and hold them together. That's half the strip, so we need to do that again. and it just needs a strip of silky oak to finish it off. It looks a little messy, but it should sand up fine. That's the coaming finished. Now we need to fiberglass it, but first it needs a fillet of resin mixed with sawdust. The fiberglass around the coaming is a bit tricky, but it's not too difficult. With a bit of patience and a bent acid brush, we managed and did a decent job. Once it was tacked off, we trimmed up the fiberglass for a neat edge and flipped the deck over and fiberglassed the inside. Next, we need to varnish the inside of the hull and the deck, and this will give the epoxy some added protection and fill any pinholes that may still be there. We're using a water-based marine varnish which will dry fast and keep the project moving along. Next, we need to join the deck and the hull together with fiberglass strips, but first we need to mask up the insides, leaving an exposed section for the fiberglass strips to stick to. We were quite shocked to find that the deck and the hull don't match up, but apparently this is very normal, which can be caused by quite a few different factors. Anyway, we just need to wrestle it into shape. We're spreading the sides of the hull out, and then we'll use reinforced packing tape to pull the edges of the deck down and into position. Some straps and a paint scraper are also handy to line things up. Once they're in position, the friction of the edges pulled together with the tape are enough to hold everything in place. After taping the outside to stop resin from leaking through the joint from the inside, we position the kayak on its side ready to join them together. We cut a tape off a roll of cloth, which we realised after starting would have been easier with a proper roll of fiberglass. The edges are frayed and they easily catch back on themselves. After applying resin, Corin rolled it up and began to join the kayak together. He needs to get inside the kayak and roll out the strip by steering it with a brush on a stick. It looked pretty awkward and I still have this to come when I finish mine, but Corin managed very well. Next morning we started preparing the bow and the stern for outer stems and to give the inside of the deck and the hull joints a bit longer to set before removing all the tape. Here I'm cutting thin white mahogany strips to laminate the outer stems. While they're setting up, we felt confident enough to remove the tape from the outside of the joint. Next we shaped the outer stems to the hull and Corin worked on the one end while I worked on the other. They didn't take too long to do and we took the kayak outside to prepare the external deck and hull joint and also to prepare for some reinforced strips of fiberglass either end of the keel. The reinforcement strips went well. Next we did the outer seam, which was also pretty straightforward. We are rushing things a little as we're running out of time, but it's still going very well. Now I'm brushing a fill coat onto the whole kayak, doing the hull first and then leaving it for a few hours and then flipping it over to fill coat the deck. One part of the process that we didn't film and we did when we had the opportunity was to stand the kayak upright and pour a cup of epoxy into each end just to strengthen them. We're getting towards the end and now we need to sand the epoxy back smooth, going through the grits to leave a good finish for the varnish. We realised that we didn't feather out the fiberglass seams with the sander quite enough before the fill coat, so off camera we gave the seams and the hull another fill coat which put the project back one more day. We then sanded it again, finishing with wet sanding and then started to apply the varnish. The varnish is a must, especially on the outside, as the epoxy isn't UV stable and it will yellow, and the varnish just gives it that extra protection all round and it finishes it off well. The water-based varnish was great, it's easy to apply and we built up the coats quickly with the whole kayak getting 3 coats. It looks fantastic and we're both super happy with it. We did cut corners a little, but it's still a very good finish and we're both very proud of it. Here's a few final shots in the last light of the day. In the morning we'll take it for a paddle and then Corin will head home. It still needs a seat, which Corin will sort out himself later on, but for this morning he'll just be a bit uncomfortable. The varnish is barely dry, but anyway, here it is on its maiden voyage. It's a shame I didn't get mine done to join Corin, but I did go for a paddle, but just in a different kayak. It looked awesome on the water, and Corin pretty much had a smile on his face the whole time. And I should mention that Corin is an experienced kayaker, unlike myself, but I can't wait to finish mine and give it a go too. Let me know what you think about another video finishing mine and what you think of a kumiko deck design. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and hopefully you're inspired to make a kayak yourself. It's a very achievable project. It's just lots of small doable steps. If you are interested, be sure to check out Guillemot Kayaks or Nick Sharder's YouTube channel, and I'll put links in the description. Thanks to Corin for hanging out in the workshop for a couple of weeks. We had an awesome time. If you did enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.